Hello everyone and welcome to the Evangelist Nick Garrett channel. Before watching today's video, make sure you check out part 1 of Martin Luther, linked in the video description below. So Martin Luther nailed protests to the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. He didn't intend for it to make its way to Rome, but the Pope saw it, and he set up an inspection for Luther. But then he thought better of giving this German monk, with his protests against indulgences, simony, and corruption in the papacy, an audience, and instead he handed Luther back down to the local clerical administration in Augsburg, Germany, Cardinal Cajetan. This all took place while something unique was happening with the German people and people all over Europe in the developing nation states. The German people themselves, inspired by Luther, began developing a revolutionary spirit regarding their faith and other aspects of their lives. From the people's view, Luther's boldness indicated that maybe the time was now for them to stand on their own against the oppressive and archaic dogmas. Ignorance and fear of reprisal by the church had kept many in line for a long time, while still others supported and believed Rome was right to squash dissension. The Pope had also issued a bull directly on Luther regarding 41 of the 95 statements in his theses, giving him a period of time to recant. The papal bull was met with outrage throughout Germany, though, and Luther's supporters publicly burned the papal documents. In his essay, Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, Paul A. Bishop best summarized what happened next. Quote, in 1521, Pope Leo X issued a Decet Romanum Pontificum, banishing Luther from the church. The matter was then turned over to secular authorities, and Luther was ordered to appear before the Diet of Worms. Emperor Charles V personally directed the assembly. Luther was to address the assembly concerning whether he had authored the various writings attributed to him and if he espoused their contents. Fearing for Luther's safety, the elector Prince Frederick III of Saxony secured an assurance that Luther would receive free passage to and from the assembly. Luther's arrival in Worms set the stage for the theological showdown that was to follow. Johann Eck, a former friend of Luther's turned enemy, represented the empire as the assistant to the archbishop of the archdiocese. Eck had been responsible for the delivery of several papal bulls regarding Luther. Upon questioning, Luther refused to recant or retract any of his writings on grounds that both by Holy Scripture and his own conscience as led by God, he was determined to stand firm by his beliefs. The assembly then moved to confidential conferences to render its decisions. These conferences would last several days before sentence would be passed regarding Luther's fate. In the end, the verdict pronounced upon Martin Luther was to be most severe. He was declared to be a heretic and an outlaw. His literature was to be banned, and he was to be arrested. It also became a crime for anyone within the empire to give Luther safe haven. Further, the assembly sanctioned the death of Martin Luther with no legal consequences under the law. In the eyes of many, the church was now forgiving the used secular authorities to condone murder. End quote. Prince Frederick III resented what he considered the church's overreach into his secular power and the precedent-setting behavior of the church over his laws. Moreover, Luther was very popular with the people. Frederick, instead of conforming to the church's edict, had Luther secretly whisked away to Wartburg Castle, where he lived years in exile, hiding from the officials and mercenaries of the Catholic Church. During his exile, Luther continued to write against the church. He also wrote the first German Bible and inscribed it to his benefactor, Prince Frederick III. In Germany, regional monarchs began putting the political and secular best interest of their nation-states before the edicts of the church. At least in Germany's case, and it was plainly visible by other nation-states, Rome was becoming quite unreasonable, corrupted, and violent. Now Martin's life would never be the same. Far from being happy about having started a revolution that would be painful for the German people, he developed a dry sarcasm, boldness, and resentment that, being on the side of truth, landed him in hiding and a life of exile. His theology, while genius in certain areas, showed his bias in others. As far back as his time teaching in Wittenberg, he had been unable to reconcile his justification by God's grace through faith alone teaching with some of the books of the New Testament. He often criticized the book of James and said, quote, "We should throw the epistle of James out of this school, for it doesn't amount to much. It contains not a syllable about Christ. Not once does it mention Christ except at the beginning. I maintain that some Jew wrote it who probably heard about Christian people but never encountered any," end quote. Most believers never notice the great contradictions that exist not only between James's and Paul's writings, but are never taught how one is to reconcile them as believers. It would seem there is no answer for this in any church today. The church seems to bear the scars of this discrepancy, even while so many still call out sola scriptura. In time, Luther became acutely aware of the discrepancies in the views of apostolic doctrine. In his defense, Martin Luther must have become very downtrodden and cynical, with good reason. He went from challenging legitimate immorality in the church and contradictions in doctrine to being punished for what in his eyes was simply devotion to truth. Shouldn't each Christian be first and foremost devoted to truth? In the end, he failed to reach the high ideal of holiness and reverence that he sincerely desired for Christianity in the Catholic Church and in himself. Instead, he started a revolution that some could easily argue eventually added much more confusion than clarity to accompany the holy freedom of the gospel. Earlier great shifts in the faith under Pope Urban II had fallen short too, as it had again under Pope Innocent III and so many others. Perhaps the cycle emerging reveals quite plainly everything man touches of the divine falls short, and brings into further relief just how important the forgiveness that comes in Jesus Christ is. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next time when we show some of the correspondence between Martin Luther and the papacy, and we take a look at Martin Luther in later life. At that time, we're going to go ahead and get into the Reformation in England. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next time.